Honorable Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi said this about protesters and protests in India.
पिछले कुछ समय से इस देश में एक नई जमात पैदा हुई है, एक नई बिरादरी सामने आई है और वो है आंदोलन जीवी। ये जमात आप देखोगे, वकीलों का आंदोलन है वो न वहां नजर आएंगे, स्टूडेंट का आंदोलन है वो वहां नजर आएंगे, मजदूर का आंदोलन है वो वहां नजर आएंगे, कभी पर्दे के पीछे कभी पर्दे के आगे। एक पूरी टोली है जी जो आंदोलन जीवी है। वो आंदोलन के बिना जी नहीं सकते हैं और आंदोलन से जीने के लिए रास्ते खोजते रहते हैं। हमें ऐसे लोगों को पहचानना होगा कि वो जो सब जगह पे पहुंच करके और बड़ा आइडियोलॉजिकल स्टैंड दे देते हैं, गुमराह कर देते हैं, नए नए तरीके बता देते हैं। देश आंदोलन जीवी लोगों से बचे, इसके लिए हम सबको, और ये उनकी ताकत है। उनका क्या है, खुद खड़ा नहीं कर सकते चीजें, किसी की चल रही तो जाके बैठ जाते हैं।
And now, the Honorable Supreme Court of India has said right to protest cannot be anytime and everywhere, while dismissing the review petition against Shaheen Bagh CAA protests judgment on 13th of February. The Honorable Bench said that democracy and dissent go hand in hand, but then the demonstrations expressing dissent have to be in designated places alone. The apex court said that the constitutional scheme comes with a right to protest and express dissent, but with an obligation to have certain duties. There may be some spontaneous protests, but in case of prolonged dissent or protest, there cannot be continued occupation of public place affecting rights of others. The question that we are trying to understand here is this: are protests good for democracy? Are protests testing grounds for the health of a democratic country or democracy? Do protests result in chaos or change? As per an article on opendemocracy.net, there are 6 reasons why protest is so important for democracy. Let's have a look at some of them. First reason is that people realize that they are not alone. It simply means that public demonstrations and marches empower people by showing them there are thousands of other people who think the same things. For example, anti-CAA protest first started in Assam on December 4th, 2019, and slowly people started protesting from across the country. Second reason is that by protesting, people alter the agenda and start a debate. Sometimes even when there is a huge number of people protesting, the incumbent government tries to give reasons as to why the protesters might be wrong. This is done to either defame them or to belittle them. And this is the time when debates and arguments on issues begin. For example, farmers' protest started in India mainly from Punjab in 2020, and slowly it gained support from other places across the country as farmers in other places also began their demonstrations. Third reason is that in an electoral democracy, protest provides an essential voice for minority groups. The article says that often the majority threatens to impose the tyranny of the majority, and that's when protests and demonstrations work as vital corrective to majority rule. अच्छा, ये कैसे होता है फिर? For example, in Sri Lankan civil war, the majority Sinhalese had allegedly started majoritarianism and marginalization of Tamil minorities in the country. And you know what? The article says sometimes we, means people, win also. Now let's see what the Brookings Institution article "Protesting is as important as voting" has to say. While talking about George Floyd and Jacob Blake that resulted in widespread Black Lives Matter protests and movements in the US, the article says, but the shooting of Jacob Blake proves that protesting is not something to be moved away from. Instead, if protesting is indeed the catalyst for the structural change, now is the chance to escalate the movement for racial justice. As per the same article, 2020 evaluation of the 1960s civil rights demonstrations found that subordinate minorities can successfully drive media coverage, framing congressional speech and public opinion when engaging in non-violent protest. The report says that non-violent protests have been a force behind positive social change. The same report says one more thing, that there is plenty of proof that protests alter voting behaviors, shift the attitudes of marginal voters, and mobilize many previously disengaged voters. Many experts say that protests are linked to policy and therefore the country's marches, rallies, boycotts and gatherings in the name of racial justice must continue if one expects subordinate and substantive structural change. Talking of how protests are linked to policies and change in democracy, do you know that after around 100 years of protests, demonstrations and agitations as part of the women's suffrage movement, women had finally got the right to vote in the United States. After decades of protests and movements, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, enfranchising all American women and declaring that women deserve all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. But, it's not that protests always help the particular cause that has made people to protest and agitate in the democratic setup. These are the questions. Does non-violent protest help or violent protest? Is it not the case that non-violent protest actually kill the cause and the movement itself? As per an article in the New Yorker, Omar Wasso, a professor of politics at Princeton who studies protest movements and their effects on politics and elections, says non-violent protests can be very effective if they are able to get media attention. He says that when the state indulges in any kind of violence on the protesters get sympathetic press coverage. But when protesters engage in violence, it actually works against their cause and interests. मतलब ये है कि non-violent protests are not effective and in fact that often kills the movement itself. But one thing is clear from these examples that most of the social changes and transition of powers have taken place in favor of people through protests, and this has happened across the world and here in India too.